Thank you, everybody, for coming out this evening to learn some very interesting things about a very important topic. So, as everyone here knows, the United States has long been involved in the Middle East, but what that involvement should look like, or whether there should be any involvement at all, has been the subject of fierce debate both in America and around the world. As we look back at decades of U.S. involvement in the region, there are many questions we must ask ourselves. Questions such as, what lessons can be learned from our involvement in the Middle East? What are our goals in the region? And what efforts have been successful in achieving them? And perhaps most importantly, where should we go from here in times of increasingly turbulent global politics? So thankfully, we have our speaker tonight, Stephen Cook, who will help us answer some of these questions. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Chat and Chowder. My name's James DeVellis. I'm the chair of the World Boston Board of Directors. Mary Eintema, our president and CEO, sends her best regards from the World Affairs Councils of America meeting in Dallas. That's our umbrella organization that we're part of. So I'm here filling in for her tonight, and certainly delighted that you are all here joining us. So before we get started, a couple quick reminders. As you may know, the mission of World Boston is to foster engagement in international affairs and global cooperation among people of all nations. So by being here tonight, you are helping us in furtherance of that mission. And right away to start with some quick thank yous. So I'll thank our hosts, Foley and Lardner, which is also where I work for my day job, for hosting us in this great, beautiful space. I'm a partner here at Foley in the Intellectual Property Department, and it's obviously a pleasure to be able to welcome you guys here and the World Boston community here for this and all of the other Chat and Chowders that we host. Thank you, of course, as always, to the World Boston staff and to the board for making this program possible. And thank you to the Lowell Institute, who generously supports our Chat and Chowder and Great Decisions series, as well as our annual State of the State Department program. I will point out that a donation of a mere $25 allows you to join our circle of 2024 community supporters. And a special thank you to the generous member who made a donation with their tickets to tonight's events, specifically Tonya Hongsermeyer. Thank you. You can make a tax-deductible donation to World Boston at any time on our website or by using any of the QR codes that are conveniently located on your tables this evening. We also want to thank our blogger for tonight's events, Lawrence Brown, here somewhere. Thank you, Lawrence. Lawrence is a student at Northeastern and writes for the Huntington News. So please be sure to read his recap of tonight's program on the World Boston website. And you can also try to find it on LinkedIn and other similar networks. Next, very quickly for upcoming events, we hope to see you at the Boston Public Library just a couple blocks away on June 25th for our annual State of the State Department program. This is one of our biggest and best events of the year, so please do join us. We're thrilled to host Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, Richard Verma, for a discussion on national security, together with Monica Duffy Toft. You may recall that Monica was here in this room back in April for her own Chat and Chowder program, so we're very happy to have her back. Please don't miss this excellent program. You can learn more about this and other programs, again, by scanning the QR codes on the flyers around the room, which you can also use to register for these events. Finally, a quick note on housekeeping. This evening, when we turn to audience question and answer, please just raise your hand. I'll call on you. Someone from the World Boston staff will bring a microphone to you for you to ask your questions. We will also try to take several questions from our Zoom audience who is joining us here live this evening. For the Zoom folks, please submit your questions in the Q&A box, and our staff will read them out loud. Now, at long last, tonight's program, we're thrilled to be joined again by Stephen Cook. For the sake of time, I'll abbreviate Stephen's bio, which you can read in full on our website. So Stephen is the Eni Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies and Director of the International Affairs Fellowship for Tenured International Relations Scholars at the Council for Foreign Relations. Quite a mouthful. Prior to joining CFR, Stephen was a research fellow at the Brookings Institution and a SORAF research fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He is an expert on Arab and Turkish politics, as well as U.S. Middle East policy. Stephen is the author of several books, including False Dawn, Protest, Democracy, and Violence in the New Middle East, The Struggle for Egypt from Nasser to Tahrir Square, and Ruling but Not Governing, the Military and Political Development in Egypt, Algeria, and Turkey. His latest book, and the topic of tonight's discussion, The End of Ambition, is hot off the presses and was just published last week. So in addition to his books, Stephen is a columnist at Foreign Policy Magazine and is also published widely in international affairs journals, opinion magazines, and newspapers, and is a frequent commentator on both radio and television. So thank you, Stephen, for joining us tonight. With that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Hello? This is on, right? I generally don't need a microphone. Oh, you took the picture down, because it's nice when you know a fairly famous photographer who's willing to take your book jacket photos. But it's wonderful to be here with you this evening. Thank you all for coming. Just a few things before I get into the talk. First, I just want to say that when this program was advertised initially on LinkedIn, I shared it, or on Twitter, I shared it and said how much I was looking forward to being in Boston and talking, despite all the Red Sox fans. And I do want to point out that my Yankees are in first place, and so that was to start. Second, it's really wonderful to be in a place where I grew up on Long Island. I'm not the one with the funny accent, so thanks. That's really nice to be here. But two other things. One, I thank you once again, James. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation from World Boston, and your firm just has this unbelievable, beautiful. And I'm sad that I'm standing in front of it, and I'm not the beautiful view of the Boston area. I want to welcome some special folks here this evening. First, my in-laws are here with me this evening. We forgot my wife, but my in-laws were able to be here. And I do want to point out my freshman college roommate, Bruce Mendelson, is here. And today's his birthday. I'm not sure I would come to his talk on my birthday, but he's come to my talk on his birthday, and I'm genuinely touched and thrilled. And it's wonderful to see you. I haven't seen you since February. So and you look good on your 56th birthday. Not bad, kiddo. Not bad. I mean, no hair, but still, you look good. In any event, it's great to be here. There's a ton that's going on in the Middle East, and I actually finished this book before the war in Gaza began, but it was fortunately able to. Sorry, I'm going to move this because every time I look over here, I see only this, not all you lovely people. I was able to add to the book to account for the conflict, and I was fortunate because what I had written was essentially in line with what had happened and what was happening and what had happened over the course of the last 8 months. But what I thought I'd do this evening is kind of quickly talk to you about the origins of this book, some of the what the kind of radical intellectual project of the book is, talk about some of the argument, and then talk a little bit about how it relates to the current moment. I will say that this book was actually supposed to come out last year, and I'm sort of fortunate that it's coming out this year. Although, when you're in the business that I'm in, bad news in the world is good for me personally, which is sometimes weighs on you. It's a terrible thing what's happening in the Middle East and has been happening over the course of the last 8 months. But nevertheless, it's important for us now, while there is so much controversy around U.S. policy in the region, to understand where we've been, where we are, and where we should be going in the Middle East. But before I get into the heart of the matter, James was nice enough to mention my 3 previous books, and each book that I have written builds on questions that I ask, or leave a book and have questions. So my first book, Ruling but Not Governing, the Military in Egypt, Algeria, and Turkey, left me a lot of questions about Egypt, which was the hardest case to write about. So I wrote a book called The Struggle for Egypt, from Nasser to Tahrir Square. By the way, that book, talking about being finished, I finished that book on January 20th, 2011, and the Egyptian uprising happened 5 days later. I happened to be in Egypt. I finished the book. I was really excited. I sent it off to my publisher, and 2 days later got on the plane and went to Egypt. And then 2 days after that, the Egyptian uprising began. But that book turned into, and that experience and I was in Tahrir Square for the beginning of the uprising in Egypt until Nancy and Dick's daughter made me come home because she thought I would get hurt. And I think she said, "You're not that young any longer. And you have 2 little kids at home." And I was like, "Oh God, I gotta leave." In any event, that experience then turned into my 3rd book, which was called False Dawn, which was about the uprisings in the region and why they didn't become democracies. Why 2011, 2012 in the Middle East was not 1989 and 1990 in like Central and Eastern Europe. And that book then was the beginning of the end of ambition. And in that book, False Dawn, one of the chapters is called Scarecrows Getting the Middle East Right. And that comes from, as I said, I had been in Tahrir Square and I came home from Tahrir Square and Washington was abuzz. I mean, Washington, this was the biggest story to happen in Washington at that moment, the uprisings in the Arab world. And I would go to meetings and meetings and meetings. And I recount a meeting that I went to at another organization, not the Council on Foreign Relations, where every Middle East watcher in Washington, D.C. had gathered to assess what had happened. And the kind of underlying theme people were talking about was, now we have an opportunity to get the Middle East right. And that seems so strange to me after spending time in Tahrir Square, where the United States was at best an afterthought, which was also odd because of so much diplomatic, economic, and political capital had been spent on the Middle East by the United States, that there was this major event and we were sort of an afterthought. And then I came back to Washington and said, they were basically saying, well, now we have an opportunity to basically get the whole thing right when we hadn't gotten it right before. This is all very, very odd to me. And so, and it got me thinking and got me thinking and got me thinking. And so it was those questions that emerged from that book that really began the kernel of the questions that I started asking about the end of ambition, which was really, what is the role? What is the proper role of the United States in the Middle East? And then the second reason why, the second kernel of the book was, it was COVID and I was stuck in the house and I couldn't go to Iraq and write a book about Iraq after 20 years after the invasion. So I would live in Washington. So I figured I'd write a book about Washington in the Middle East. I mean, it was a lot easier than going to Iraq during high COVID. So stuck in the house, but you'd be amazed. There are some really incredible things that the US government does. I didn't have to leave my home office to rummage around the State Department historian's office. It was fantastic. Like some of these resources that you can do and the research and the things that you can find out and the documents that you can unearth just from sitting at home and the things that are preserved, those are some really extraordinary things of the US government. But anyway, I couldn't go anywhere, so I wrote a book about the United States. And what the question it was, in thinking about, now we have the opportunity to get the Middle East right, the implication was that we had gotten the Middle East wrong. And in fact, if you look at the record of the United States over the course of the last 3 decades, as I said, we poured an enormous amount of financial, economic, political, diplomatic resources into the region, setting aside just the blood that had been spilled. Our return on investment for all of you in financial types, you intellectual property lawyers, our return on investment was actually less than zero. The things that we set out to do, not only did we not achieve, but we set things back. This seemed crazy. Someone's calling. It's not your daughter, which is good. And this seemed absolutely crazy. We had invested so much and our return on investment was less than zero. How could this be? Could the explanation just be that our political leaders are rubes, morons? I think there's a temptation on the part of some people to say, yes, that's the case. But it can't be the case. I'll tell you why. As I dug in further and further to this topic, what I had discovered was the United States actually wasn't didn't always fail in the Middle East. The return on investment had not always been less than zero or zero. In fact, there was a period of time when the United States by dint of what policymakers set out to do in the Middle East, the United States was fairly successful. That's not to suggest that there weren't setbacks or moral costs, but in between arguably 1945 and 1991, what American policymakers set out to do in the Middle East, they actually achieved those goals. And like I said, there were setbacks. The 1973 war was a setback because that represented a clash of two of America's three core interests in the Middle East. One, the free flow of energy resources in the region. Two, helping to ensure Israeli security. In that war, the United States was forced to choose, and we chose. And it was a moment when the one time only oil didn't flow. There were other setbacks. The Iranian Revolution was undoubtedly a setback to US policy. But after 35 years of support for the Shah, you could say, hey, that was not a bad policy because the Shah helped the United States advance its three core interests in the region, helping to ensure the free flow of oil from the region, helping to ensure Israeli security, and making sure that the United States was the predominant power in the Middle East. That's all we tried to do, particularly starting in the 1970s all the way up through the early 1990s. Well, what changed? What was it that changed? Okay, here's the pre-interactive portion of our session. Does anybody here, you may not answer, sir, does anybody remember what happened on February 26, 1991? Anyone? Nope. February 26, 1990. How quickly we forget. Sir, not the invasion of Kuwait. The invasion of Kuwait happened on August 2nd, 1990, which happened to be my 21st birthday, which prompted one of Bruce and I, our other friends, to call me and say, oh, Stephen, you got what you wanted for your birthday, a war in the Middle East, which is not actually true. February 26, 1991 is when the Iraqis gave up. The end of the war. Operation Desert Storm had come to an end. Okay, next pre-interactive moment. What happened exactly 10 months later? No. I'm here at warmer. No. No, that was 1980. Huh? No. This 10 months after February 26, 1991 is December 26, 1991. What happened on December 26, 1991? The hammer and sickle came down over the Kremlin for the very last time, the final collapse of the Soviet Union. And that left those two events, one, the defeat of Saddam Hussein after he invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, reinforced the idea that the United States was the predominant power in the Middle East. We were good to our word in that we would defend the region from both external and internal challenges. That was laid out in the Carter Doctrine, in the Reagan corollary to the Carter Doctrine. And on December 26th, the end of the Cold War, it was over. In 1 minute and 40 seconds that it took for that flag to come down, the whole bipolar system ended. And there was one power left in the world, and that was the United States. And the United States was left with an enormous amount of power to do what it wanted to do with it. And so what did we do? We expanded NATO. We supported economic shock therapy in the former communist economies of Eastern and Central Europe and the Soviet Union. We supported globalization, the belief that we would all look like each other at some point. I'm a political scientist by training, and there was a time in the second half of the 20th century where political scientists believed that we would all develop to a point where we'd all start to look like each other. That was essentially globalization. And when you looked at the Middle East seemed to be the one part of the world, with the exception of Africa, that was lagging behind other parts of the world. It was most in need of help. And so the United States embarked on an ambitious effort to transform the Middle East. Now, this was a bipartisan effort. Democrats and Republicans engaged in these efforts to use American power to make good things happen in the world. This is different from what we tried to do in the immediate post-World War II era, beginning really in the late 60s, early 1970s, in which the United States used its power to prevent bad things from happening to its interests. You starting to see the difference? When we pursued a policy of prevention, we actually achieved our goals. When we sought to leverage our power to make good things happen, which I'll get into in a minute, we didn't do a very good job of it. And what were those good things? So start with the mid 1990s. Newly elected President Bill Clinton, young dude, you know, whatever, Fleetwood Mac, don't stop thinking about tomorrow. I mean, really, this is really, you know, don't stop. He in fact said he wanted to pull the countries of the Middle East into the 21st century. And how were they going to do that? They were going to make peace in the Middle East on the theory that if you ended the Arab-Israeli conflict, the justification for the large authoritarian national security states of the Arab world would cease to exist. The rationale for them, and then they would then transform into more democratic, open societies. It was elegant in its thinking, but it misapprehended the reason why these countries are actually authoritarian. But there was nevertheless, that was a secondary goal of the Clinton administration, was that you would get democracy through peace. Then you have George W. Bush. You have 9/11. 9/11 is not, you know, people say, oh, 9/11. It was a moment where everything changed. What I write in the book, it's not the moment when everything changed. It was an enabling moment. It was a hinge moment. It was a moment where a lot of the debates about transforming the Middle East that were happening in the 1990s were able to be operationalized. So after 9/11, democracy promotion became an antidote to terrorism, despite the fact that there was scant evidence that democracy actually was an antidote to terrorism. And in parallel to that, the idea was that if you had reform, you would get peace. President Bush flipped Clinton's logic on its head and said, where Clinton said, we get peace, we get reform, Bush says, you get peace through reform. And then, of course, you have a fuller articulation of this idea in what Bush called his forward strategy of freedom in the Middle East, the freedom agenda, in which the United States devoted resources to changing societies, to engage in a social engineering project in countries half a world away. The biggest example of this was Operation Iraqi Freedom. Now, of course, this was sold to all of us on the idea that Saddam Hussein was a threat to global peace. And there was a belief that, and it was widely held, and it was bipartisan. I will remind people, anybody here from Vermont? Anyone? No one came in from Vermont to hear me speak? Oh my God, I'm outraged. Oh, you're from Vermont.
I come down from.
Oh, okay. Do you live there now?
No,
Oh, okay. Well,
I grew up there.
Oh, okay. Does anybody live in Vermont now? All right, good. I will point out that the senior senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, a liberal lion, a progressive lion, voted for the Iraq Liberation Act of 1998, which was the predicate for the invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq, because on the idea that there was this great threat to global security. But when the Secretary of Defense said to President Bush, we should, when we overthrow Saddam Hussein, just put another dictator in that chair, another Iraqi general to run the place, and then we can get out. The President of the United States said, we're not doing it. We're not going halfway around the world to protect global peace and leave Iraq in the hands of another dictator. It's only going to work if we make Iraq a democracy. And that was a rationale for what was called Operation Iraqi Freedom. And then you have the Obama year. Now, President Obama is super, super interesting. This is a guy who was once described to me by someone who worked for him as a realist who felt bad about it. So when he came to office, he wanted to pull back from this ambitious transformation. But the Arab uprisings happened. And this was an extraordinary event. absolutely extraordinary event. And President Obama gave a speech in May 2011 that no one remembers, nobody asked for, only people like me paid attention to. You're shaking your head. Do you pay attention to it too? You remember that one? We're the only two. We're the only two. But President Obama, who in June of 2009, 6 months after he was inaugurated, traveled all the way to Cairo and spoke at Cairo University and said, look, we're done with the freedom agenda. If you become democracies, we'll help you, and so on and so forth. But he was really lukewarm to the whole idea of this. He thought that this was madness. And it went hand in hand with his criticism of the invasion of Iraq. But once these uprisings happened, President Obama in May 2011 went to the State Department and gave a speech that George W. Bush could have given. If you read this, when you heard it, it was like, oh, okay. But then when you read it, you're like, are you sure President Obama gave this speech and not President Bush? It was this kind of idea about, and the quote was, and I use it a lot in the book, is now we have a chance to shape the world as we would like it rather than how it is. And that is how the American foreign policy community viewed the world, that we can make the world, we don't have to accept the world as it is. We can make it how we want it. We can make it in our own image. And another way President Obama was super interesting. His nuclear agreement was not just an arms control agreement. Central to that agreement was the idea or the belief that the Iranians would want a new relationship with the United States as a result of this agreement. And that it would fundamentally rearrange the regional order such that, as he famously told Jeffrey Goldberg from the Atlantic magazine, that the Saudis and the Iranians and the Emiratis and everybody would learn to share the region. Though there was very little evidence that the Iranians wanted to share the region. The historical record is actually that the Iranians make limited agreements in one realm and continue their malevolent activities in their other realm, because their ultimate goals are to push the United States out of the Middle East, to destroy Israel, and to write the rules of the road in the region themselves, not to share the region. So there are all these kinds of assumptions that led the United States to try to use its power to make good things happen that ended badly for the United States. Now, in Obama's defense, he didn't blow up the JCPOA. His successor blew up the JCPOA. But the problem with that agreement was the hunch central to it in the belief that the Iranians wanted something that we wanted without any real evidence that they wanted the same things that we want. Okay, so let me wind this up and wind this down, and I will point to what's happening in the region right now. What is it that we should be doing in the Middle East? Now that we know that using American power to make good things happen has led to a negative return on investment, can we just return to that previous era? That's a little too pat. It's a little too neat. Too much has happened in the world. But my plea to the American foreign policy community, of which I'm a part, is that we need to drop this idealistic view of U.S. foreign policy and understand something that we haven't understood in a very, very long time, which is what is important to the United States in the Middle East, and then devote resources to those things that are important to the region, adjust for what our adversaries and partners must do, which is a long way of saying we should really have a strategy in that. Now, I gave a similar talk in Cambridge this morning, in which I said that I work in the second smartest city in the world, because I had to bow to the, guys who think they're really smart at Harvard. Not really sure. Anyway, but I work in one of the smartest cities in the world. And if you go down on the street in Washington, D.C., and my office is a block from the White House, it's 3 blocks from the State Department, lots of really, really smart people walking around. And if you ask them 2 questions, you'll get crazy answers. First, you ask them, what is strategy? And people will tell you all kinds of things, mostly come to some kind of synonym for important. That's not what strategy is. Strategy is what I just described. The other question that you ask people in Washington, D.C. is, what is important to the United States in the Middle East? And you get the kind of the funniest. I actually have I would, this is probably why I was never invited back. I would be invited to the Foreign Service Institute, and I would give a talk, and I would ask foreign service officers what's important to the United States, and I would write it down on a, this was before there were whiteboards, it was just an easel and big magic marker, and I write all these things out. Eventually we would get to some of the things that were important, but we'd also get some of like really crazy answers to it. So what I wanted to do is clarify what's important to us and how we devote resources to it. But I want you to read the book, so I'm not going to give it all away. I'm just going to tell you the six of the things, the six things that I think that are important. And I'll kind of nod to, you know, there are some things that'll be familiar to, and then there's some things that'll be new, and I'll nod to my different twists on those six themes. But I call this because you have to call it something. If you write a book about U.S. foreign policy and you're sort of laying out a strategy, and I didn't want it to be a grand strategy, but you have to call it something. The president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations read a draft on this. He's like, no, you have to call it something. So believe me, this is how the sauce made. I sat around my office and Googled synonyms for words to come up with something. It was really like that. It's like back of the envelope. So I call this prudential conservatism. Prudential in the sense of prudence. Conserve our. Be careful. Use our power in a prudential way, not to just kind of go off half-cocked in the world. Using our power because we have it. And conservatism, not in the. This is not a political statement. Not in the Fox News conservatism. Conservatism, literally to conserve. I think you'll find agreement across the board that this kind of ambition, this delusion-fueled ambition that propelled American foreign policy for 30 years, sapped our power. We spent on things that weren't important, and that's my cause to really assess a clear-eyed way of assessing how the world is and how we should use our resources in the world. And there are six things that we should use our resources on in the Middle East. Some of them are familiar. The first is what in the book I call the Prime Directive. Prevent, for Star Trek fans, I call it the Prime Directive. That is continuing to prevent disruptions to the free flow of oil resources from the region. Okay, before all you environmentalists kill me, I just want to say, one, I drive an EV, I compost, and I do all kinds of other things. I've never bought an offset from an airline because I don't believe that's how they're going to use it. But whatever. We are not going to decarbonize our societies. Certainly not in our lifetime, not my lifetime, not my children's lifetime, not their children's lifetime. It's everything that surrounds us is based on hydrocarbons. We can reduce that amount, but we still will we'll still need this part of the world. Even if we are the largest producers of oil in the world, which we are, it's a global market. And we can't just seal ourselves off from the rest of the world. It is important that there be no disruptions to the free flow of energy resources. Not only is this a national interest, it's also a parochial interest of politicians, right? Because when the price of oil goes up, what happens to the price of gasoline at the pump? It also goes up. And I live in a super blue county of a super blue state. And I remember in the spring of 2021, when the price of gas was, oh my God, $3.75, there was a little picture of President Biden on the gas pump with an arrow at the price and it said, this is my fault. Now, it wasn't his fault, but nevertheless, presidents, politicians have a parochial interest. So that's two reasons why the free flow of energy resources out of the Gulf are going to be important, and they should be, actually. Second, it still will remain, and I call this a legacy interest in the book, and I'll tell you why. It still is in the interest of the United States to help prevent threats to Israeli security, but that is clearly changing. The U.S.-Israel relationship is clearly changing, and the way in which we go about this must change, and I'm not going to tell you anymore. You have to read the book. Third, counterterrorism. We're going to continue to be concerned about counterterrorism because even though we are 23 years beyond, almost to the date of 9/11, there are terrorist threats out there, at home, abroad. And if you don't think the last 8 months have had an impact on the worldview of extremists or as a recruiting mechanism for extremists, you haven't been paying attention. And my plea in the book is if only administrations read their own counterterrorism strategies, we'd be in a much better place than we were going off to remake the world in other places as part of our counterterrorism strategy. The counterterrorism strategy of the last 4 administrations have been spot on, absolutely within lines of prudential conservatism, yet we do crazy things when it comes to that, in part because of politics. 4th thing, we'll continue to be concerned about non-proliferation, but this may be the most controversial part of the book. What I say is, let's be clear-eyed. Let's accept the world as it is, and Iran is a nuclear-capable state. And what that does is that creates enormous incentives on the part of Washington's partners in the region for themselves to proliferate. And here I'm talking specifically about Saudi Arabia, which we are actually engaged in a negotiation now to supply the Soviets with civilian nuclear power. One of the things that is tripping us up, though, is that the Saudis will not agree to what's called the additional protocol of the IAEA, and you read the book. And the reason why they're reluctant to do that is because they want the option open to actually proliferate. If the Iranians are going to do it, we're going to do it. And what I say in the book is, listen, we should do everything possible to prevent the Saudis from getting nuclear technology for weapons. We should use all the diplomatic tools. But at that moment, when it becomes clear that they are going to proliferate, we actually should help them. Because if we don't help them, it won't be a stable, secure nuclear program. And that's the most dangerous thing to happen. And that's exactly what we did with Pakistan, is that President Obama at the last minute came in and said, okay, the Pakistanis are now a full-on nuclear state. We need to help stabilize this situation. Otherwise, there's going to be huge, huge problems. And then 2 new things, climate, and not in the sense that we need to solve the climate crisis and the Middle East is the key to this, or the idea that a horrible conflict like the Syrian conflict is a climate conflict, as has been reported by any number of very famous people, King Charles, Vice President Al Gore, various members of the Senate, Tom Friedman, all have said or written that Syria is the first climate conflict. There's really no evidence to suggest that that was the case. What I'm talking about is something different. And that is, when people don't have water because it's so hot, what is it that they do themselves to adapt to that situation? Anybody know? What? They move. They go to a place where there is water, where it's cooler. And where are Middle Easterners most likely to go? Europe. Give this table a gold star over here. These guys get a gold star. I need more from this side of the room here, you know? They get up and they go to Europe. And we have an experiment like that. In 2015, millions of Syrians sought safety from a civil war in Europe. Germany took in 1 million Syrians. What did that do to German politics or French politics or Dutch politics or British politics? What is it doing? What is the large numbers of migrants showing up on our border doing to our politics? In Germany, there's like real deal Nazis, not like far right politicians, not the Melonis of Italy or Marine Le Pen in France and so on. No, like real deal swastika Nazis are in Germany. The AfD, which has a significant amount of support, particularly in the country's east, that's really scary stuff. And a core global interest of the United States is the stability, prosperity, and unity of Europe. So let's do things, and we have the ability, even across conflict lines, to do things to help people adapt in their own places and help them with their water scarcity. You have to read about it in the book if you really want to know. And then finally is great power competition. Now, count me as somewhat of a skeptic on this great power competition thing that, you know, Washington is a buzz about. Particularly when you look at the Middle East, one of our global competitors, the Chinese, actually share our interests in the abstract. Like, they should want the free flow of energy resources. They should want freedom of navigation, but they've cut separate deals with people so that the United States and its allies are trying to keep the Red Sea open. And Chinese shipping goes through the Red Sea and communicates to the Houthis, Chinese ship, Chinese crew, and they don't get fired up. So it's clear there is a problem here. But what I suggest that we do when it comes to great power competition, particularly the Chinese, we can talk about the Russians after. I don't have enough time here this evening. There's not enough chowder. I did mention it is spelled incorrectly somewhere. I thought it was with an A. This guy tells me it's an ER. I'm not sure. That our partners in the region don't like it and hedge with our adversaries when we say we're going to do something and then we don't do it. And I'll give you the perfect example of that. In the summer of 2019, the Iranians took vessels in the Persian Gulf, oil, shipping, bunkering ships, all kinds of. They shot down a U.S. surveillance drone over the Persian Gulf, international airspace. And the summer culminated in mid-September when the Iranians attacked 2 major Saudi oil processing facilities. And what did President Trump say? He said, well, they attacked Saudi Arabia. They didn't attack us. So why should we respond? And it was the one, believe me, I live there. It was the one moment of bipartisan consensus in Trump's Washington. All the Democrats said, yeah, that's right. We don't want to defend, this is the way they framed it, we don't want to defend Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, who's worse than Saddam Hussein, because we were coming off of a couple of very bad years in which, let's just say, the Crown Prince made a number of bad decisions. Okay? Really bad decisions. So we did nothing. And that alarmed our partners in the region. And they started to hedge with our adversaries, the Russians, the Chinese. They believe that the United States wants to leave them to the mercy of Iranian power. Even if we say we are committed to your security and the stability of the region, if we don't back it up, they don't believe it. Now, I'm not warmongering here, but in that moment, Republicans and Democrats together threw out the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan corollary. And then we complain when the Saudis sidle up to the Chinese. Now we're trying to correct that by this big security pact that you keep reading about daily that the Biden administration is negotiating with the Saudis, which if you are going to have a great power competition, that's something you probably want to do because the Saudis are the most important player. Apologies to any Egyptians in the room. The Saudis are the most important player in the Middle East. Are there Egyptians? You're laughing. Are you Egyptian? Yeah. Okay. So yes, right. Egyptian Saudi thing. It's like we're brothers, but we're not, and we're most important. No, we're important. 7,000 years of history. I get it. Overall, what these 6 things, what I'm pleading in the book is, we will be more successful if we focus on these 6 things that are important to us, and if we fashion our approach to preventing bad things from happening rather than trying to make good things happen. That's the kind of the radical message. And it's a counterintuitive message. And it's hard for Americans to hear that. Okay, last point. How does this all relate to what's happening in the Middle East right now? Well, we can talk about the war, but I think that the Biden administration is falling into this trap of trying to use American power to try to make good things happen. And here I'm talking about the day after. I'm not talking about the conduct of the war or anything like that. We're talking about revitalizing the Palestinian Authority, the least legitimate, most corrupt. I mean, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, is in the 18th year of a 4-year term. I had on very good authority in which the Palestinian Authority is most concerned, all the ministers of the Palestinian Authority are more concerned about how they can make money off of humanitarian relief and reconstruction than they are actually humanitarian relief and reconstruction in the Gaza Strip. Yet we're going to revitalize this. And then we're going to extend their authority to the Gaza Strip. And then we're going to have a peace process in which there's going to be a 2-state solution. Under what circumstances does anybody believe that a 2-state solution is even possible? Yet we're going to go down this road where we are going to push this idea that is long past. Unfortunately, it's long past. What I think actually the United States should be doing is rather than, I mean, let the president say whatever he wants to say about the day after and so on and so forth. But American foreign policy should understand and policymakers should understand and accept the world as it is. One, there may not be a resolution to this problem. That the most likely outcome in the current war is some version of the status quo ante, worse than what it was. And that worse is the possibility that the Israelis will resettle the Gaza Strip. That is a terrible outcome, but that's where the United States should be focusing its effort, not on some kind of fantasy, delusion-filled dream of now building a Palestinian state where there isn't one to be built. This is truly a grim topic to talk about because there really is no happy ending. People talk about, from war comes opportunity, and they always think it's a positive thing. But there are also people wanting to seek bad opportunity in the outcome. I will point out two things, and then I'll stop. One, Yahya Sinwar and Hamas are one state. I can give you the statement that they made on October 7th, which made it clear that they weren't interested in liberating Gaza or the West Bank. They're interested in liberating Palestine from the north to the south, from the river to the sea. And if you have had the opportunity like I have, and it's not one that I highly recommend, but I felt it was a professional responsibility, is to see the footage from October 7th, it's abundantly clear that Hamas attacked Israel under the terms of its 1988 charter, which calls for the destruction of Israel and the murder of Jews everywhere. In their discourse, as they were engaging in these massacres, the things that they said, the things that they did, made it clear that they were attacking Israelis under the terms of that charter. On the flip side, so that's where the locus of Palestinian politics, at least the political actors, if not all Palestinians, although I'll point out that Hamas's popularity in the Gaza Strip has plummeted where it has risen in the West Bank. In Israel, where is all the energy? It's on that radical right. You've heard the names Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich. These guys, they are the Jewish supremacists who want to resettle the Gaza Strip, who want to annex the West Bank. And this is where all the energy is on both sides. What's the basis for a two-state solution there? Let's have a thought experiment, though. Let's imagine for a moment that all of our fantasies about the guy named Benny Gantz, the Israeli politician Benny Gantz, are true. Everything you read about him being a centrist or center-left, it's not true. He actually ran to the right of Netanyahu on Gaza. But whatever. Let's just assume that the press has gotten it right for once and Gantz actually does want a two-state solution, something he's never committed to. Okay. And let's assume that there's some new leader of the Palestinian Authority who says, let's do a deal. And they negotiate and they negotiate 2 minutes. Oh, okay. I can be done in 2 minutes. And they negotiate. And the bottom line is that Israel's minimum demands for peace are not anything that the Palestinians can satisfy for their own domestic politics. And the Palestinians' minimum demands for peace is not anything that the Israelis can satisfy because of their own domestic politics. So where in that is there anything other than stalemate and continued conflict? This is what the administration is doing, is not seeing the world how it is. It's trying to make the world how it wants to be by pushing these things. And sometimes that makes things worse. Every time we go down this road and we push this, it gets worse. It gets worse. Okay. Okay, I'm done. Thank you very, very much for your time. I apologize. I should have said we should remove all sharp objects from the room before I talk. Or drink a lot of alcohol, which there is. So you should avail yourself. I apologize. I should have said that at the beginning. But anyway, my favorite part of these things is your questions. I can talk about my book forever till I'm blue in the face to my in-laws. My in-laws actually played a very important role in this book. I dragoon them to read the first chapter of every book I write. And it's usually on the beach, and I hand them pencils. And I say, read this. And then I stand over them for a half an hour, they read this, and I say, okay, tell me what my book is about. And if they can tell me, I know I can continue. If they can't tell me, then I know I have more work to do. But anyway, so I just wanted to point that out. No, not always. You told me it was bad one time. In any event, I can hear myself talk about the book. They can talk about the book. but I'm interested in your questions and your thoughts and your responses. So thank you all very, very
Indeed, Stephen, thank you. That was fascinating. So obviously you can see a whole bunch of hands popping up in the room here. So I'll point it out. I think there was one straight in the back here. Yeah, yes, please.
Thank you. Two.
And speak loudly into the mic if you could.
Yes,
And
two
also,
observations. One where action was bad, and one where inaction was bad. And the first one was when we supported the Brits, probably earlier than the period you talked about, in Iran, and we kicked out an elected president, and then the problems, Iran has hated us ever since.
And you said there was one other thing?
The second thing was the Yazidis. We did nothing, and they all suffered, and I suppose are still suffering. That's the more recent thing.
Okay, I don't want to get into the deep weeds of your second question, but I will commend to you a book called The Last Shah by a good friend and colleague of mine named Ray Takei. Ray is one of those rare analysts in Washington, rare analysts of Iran in Washington who actually speaks and reads Persian. And I think that the standard narrative of the coup against Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 is not accurate. And what Ray does is he complexifies the coup. And he points out that Mossadegh was not necessarily popular. He was deeply resented by the clerical establishment. Large parts of influential Iranian society did not like Mossadegh. And that essentially and that there was genuinely a concern within the United States and Britain that there was a leftward drift in Iran. And that the coup could not have happened if it was just something that the United States and the Brits dreamed up, that there were real societal actors that wanted to overthrow Mossadegh. But that subsequently, the Iranians have used this simplified narrative as part of their bill of particulars. That's a legal term, right? Bill of particulars against the United States. So it's a much more complex thing. But nevertheless, the point stands that the Iranian Revolution was a setback for the United States. I do have vague memories of sitting in the back of my father's Chevy and waiting in line for gasoline because there were gas shortages, not really because there were so many shortages, but there was a panic around it. And we went from a very friendly regime in Iran to one that has been manifestly hostile to us. But read that book. It's much more complex story than just, Kermit Roosevelt came up with this great idea that we should overthrow the Mossadegh. It's like I said, it's worth the read, and I think it's important history that has been lost in a very simplistic narrative.
excellent. Thank you. So what I'll do, I'll sweep across the room here. I know there's a bunch of questions, and we'll take some Zoom questions in the middle and then continue to sweep across. So to start right here, please. Oh, and also to continue with the example, the more succinct the questions are, the more that we can ask. And at World Boston, questions end with a question mark.
So thank you. If I understood correctly, you suggested that a two-state solution didn't work from the perspective of either the Israelis or the Palestinians. So I know it's a huge question, but the only other option I can see is basically a fatal war where one side obliterates the other. What are you suggesting as a viable alternative to the two states?
I don't know if there's a viable alternative to two states. I mean, that's a really difficult thing for people to get their minds around. But there are some conflicts in the world that don't have an American solution to them. And what I think is likely to happen after this terrible war is, as I said before, some revert, or maybe I said it in the talk earlier today. Maybe I don't know. They're all running into each other. It's the third one of the day. But some reversion to the status quo ante is a more likely outcome of this conflict than a two-state solution. And what that means is that what we're going to see is continued Israeli occupation, the potential resettlement of the Gaza Strip, and periodic spasms of spectacular violence like we've been seeing. The Palestinians aren't going to give up. There's this whole idea in Congress, like if Israel just was victorious, then the Palestinians would give up. You would think that if the Palestinians were going to give up, they'd give up by now. But I don't see, unless there's some massive sea change in either Israeli or Palestinian politics, that a two-state solution is on the table. Now, lots of people talk about the one-state solution. I don't know. It seems to me it's sort of like a Western liberal in the classic sense, not liberal in like, yeah, stupid liberal. Liberal in the kind of sense that Israelis and Palestinians are going to find some way to live in a pluralistic, democratic society together after all of this history. Certainly, there are Palestinians and Israelis of goodwill who want to engage in a dialogue, but by and large, in particular after October 7th, and in particular after the Israeli response to October 7th, I mean, it seems beyond reality that is the case.
Very good. Thank you. So moving right along, how about right here in front and then a Zoom question and then pop over there for the last couple, please.
Oh, a quick question that you mentioned at the end of your talk about our objectives, security guarantees. The linchpin really of this ceasefire agreement that Biden administration is trying to push through is a security agreement between the US and Saudi Arabia. What is that? Is that like what we have in Asia with Japan and South Korea? Or something more vague that's going to get us bogged down indefinitely?
No, and let me just clarify. It's not to get a ceasefire. What it is it's to end the conflict. And so what the Biden administration, and this predates the conflict, that the United States would negotiate a security pact with Saudi Arabia that would be wrapped around normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, give me a minute or two to try to explain this. The Saudi-Israel normalization was the sugar to get the Senate to swallow a security pact with Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia remains unpopular on Capitol Hill. And you need 2/3 of the Senate to approve an agreement that requires the United States to come to the defense of another country. And so the bet that Biden was making was, if you wrap this thing around Saudi-Israel normalization, members of Congress, it would be too hard for them to resist because it would essentially mean the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Well, October 7th changed that. And I don't think that you're going to get 2/3 of the Senate to agree to whether there's normalization or not. And the problem with this as well is that Prime Minister Netanyahu's partners within the government, the right wing, aren't interested in normalization relations with Saudi Arabia. They're interested in absorbing the Gaza Strip and the West Bank into Israel proper. So if there's and the price that the Saudis are now asking at the behest of the United States for normalization is a credible, concrete, time-limited pathway to a Palestinian state. It's not only the right wing. 64% of Israelis say, hey, we're interested in normalization with Saudi Arabia, but we're not willing to pay the price for a two-state solution because the two-state solution is too dangerous for us. What I've said, what I've written in my column in Foreign Policy, it's time to separate these two things. If there is a real reason to have a security pact with Saudi Arabia, which I think there actually is, then it's incumbent upon the president to make the case to the Senate. But to try to wrap it around this thing with Israel, it's like the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. It's just crazily complicated. If we want to have this relationship with the Saudis, let's do it. Let's not do something insane. And so that's what is happening right now. What are the chances? And so the security guarantee that we're offering the Saudis is similar to the security guarantee that we offer to the Japanese. That's the bottom line. That's the basis of this agreement. It's not NATO. It's not Article 5 of NATO, but it's pretty robust.
Very good. Thank you. And how about some Zoom? No Zoom questions?
No Zoom
we'll
questions.
keep moving. So
You
let's
answered
keep
in order.
moving around the room here. So yes, in the back, please.
Thank you. I would argue on the two-state solution, however fictional it is, and I agree with you, it's totally unrealistic. I'm a believer in diplomacy, and I think the United States has to keep the two-state solution idea alive, if only to try to bring in some moderates, if there are any, on both sides, and use it as a negotiating tactic, or at least a starting point. And as the Israeli government has gone farther to the right, and may continue to do so, that's just going to get more and more difficult. So I would strongly argue the United States can't give up on that, even if you agree it's fictional.
I just disagree. I don't know to what end. So we say two-state solution and no one listens to us. I don't know how would you use the two-state solution as leverage to get the parties to do stuff? You know how many? Okay, there were two parties in Israel in the 1990s that are most closely associated with the two-state solution and the peace process: Meretz and Labor. How many seats does Meretz have in the Knesset? Does anybody know? Anybody? Do you know? 0. How many seats does Labor? Labor, these are the founders, the builders of Israel. How many seats does Labor have in the Knesset right now? 4. How many seats does the combination Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir? It's like the Reform Judaism Nationalism Party. I can't even remember what it's called right now. How many do they have? 13. And at one point, 14. I don't know what it is by the president of the United States working the two-state solution. Actually, I think it undermines our credibility by pursuing something over and over again and expecting a different result. I don't know.
Very good. And I think there might be 2 questions here right next to each other.
This side of
so-
the room is really.
And perhaps ask both of your questions in succession,
Oh,
and then maybe
am I
just
too-
take, no, no, not at all, but just since they're both there with the mic.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I'd like to go back to you talking about the right in Israel. I don't know if you've noticed, if you've ever been to Israel, but Israelis are not exactly quiescent types. I don't know if that might have escaped you if you've ever been there, but the Israelis I know are absolutely livid about what happened here, how this could have happened, that the Mossad dropped the ball, that the IDF wasn't there. And when this is over, they're going to be going after Ben Bibi and the rest of his right-wing clowns and say, where the hell were you? The Israelis I know are livid about this. I mean, not going to say anything right now, but it's going to end eventually. And I think the right in Israel is in trouble. I'm not Jewish, by the way, but I have a lot of friends there.
Well, so first of all, let me assure you that I've been to Israel, and let me assure you that I'm well acquainted with the kind of tumultuous politics and any number of opinions that people have. What I would say to you is take a look at the polling. And what you'll find by the implied number of seats, even though Benny Gantz and his National Unity Party would get the most seats in parliament, he would not be able to form a government. He doesn't have enough mandates on the center or left to form a government. He would have to invite in non-Zionist parties, meaning the Arab parties, to part of his coalition, which is a big no-no in Israel, which says something about, a compromised aspect of Israeli democracy. So, yes, Netanyahu is damaged, but of course he's been rising in the poll. He has his poll numbers are like 36%, which was essentially around the neighborhood they were prior to October 6th. And we don't yet know how last Saturday's rescue will play into his polling numbers. But even so, if you look at the implied number of seats, Netanyahu and the right, not Netanyahu, the right would get 58 seats. The center's left would get 57 seats. Take away the non-Zionist parties, and the right would never invite the non-Zionists. So there's one party that's in play, and that's Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu. Israel is our home. That's about as, and he doesn't like Netanyahu very much, but you can imagine him doing a deal to get himself into the government. So I think the way in which the press has reported Israeli politics has somewhat did a disservice because everybody's focused on poll numbers. In the United States, focus on poll numbers. But it's a very different electoral system where Israelis vote for parties and the president picks the guy or woman who wins the most seats. If that party, if that leader can't form a coalition, then picks the next largest. And that would likely be Netanyahu and the Likud. That's how Netanyahu became the prime minister in 2009. He didn't get as many votes. Likud didn't get as many votes. But his opponent couldn't put together a government. So I would say it's likely, not likely. There's a better chance than everybody imagines that the next prime minister of Israel would be named Netanyahu. There was another question on this end.
Yeah, going back a bit, Robert Draper in his book To Start a War said that the reason for invading Iraq, he laid it squarely at the feet of Paul Wolfowitz, who had fallen in love with the idea of spreading democracy. And he was listening to a woman named Laurie Milroy, And she thought that Saddam Hussein was behind both attacks on the World Trade Center. Can you comment on that, please?
One, I think it's abundantly clear that Paul Wolfowitz was long interested in change, democratic change in Iraq and using American power. Lori Milroy is someone who has no credibility in Washington, D.C. and never did. Whether Paul Wolfowitz, who is actually, quite successful up until this time and well-respected up until this time, whether he was listening to her or not, I have absolutely no idea. There's a lot of kind of trash out there about the war in Iraq and how it started. I'm just, there's so many tales that's I think in conspiracy theories and the president and his father and so on and so forth. You can let yourself believe anything.
So yeah, one more back there, please go right ahead.
Hi, I just had a question because you've talked about hypotheticals, whether there's a two-state solution or a one-state solution. I have a hypothetical for you. What if America was to pare down its support for Israel in the region? What would that look like? How would it affect politics in DC? And how would it affect politics in the region? Who will Israel go to then?
So this is something that I write about in the book. And what I say is there's an opportunity to reconfigure how we help prevent threats to Israeli security. There's nothing that's written that says that we have to sign more 10-year memorandums of understanding that give Israel, at least $3.5 billion a year, sometimes as much as $5.5 billion a year in military aid. Israel's GDP per capita as of 2022 was $52,000 a year. That's more than some of our NATO allies. They don't really need it. Now, okay, I get it. It's kind of weird to say that in the middle of this terrible conflict, but Israelis, this is an advanced economy with an advanced industrial base. And so what I propose is to phase out the military aid over a course of 10 years, not in a punitive way, but by agreement with the Israeli government, and replace that with things like security guarantees, treaties related to security, technology sharing, those kinds of things, the kinds of things that we do in normal relations. I call for the normalization of relations between the United States and Israel. And what that will do, to my mind, it will diminish the emotionalism around this relationship, make the United States less complicit in Israeli excesses, and allow us to have conversations about what our role is and should be in the region without this kind of thing being held against the United States. I think it would be better for the United States. I think it would be better for Israel. And weirdly, like, the Israeli right loves this idea because they think they're too dependent on the United States. So there's takers for it. We don't want to get into a situation where it's punitive, because then our politics goes crazy as a result. But by agreement, in the same way that Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he first became prime minister in the mid-1990s, negotiated a glide path to end the economic aid to Israel over the course of 10 years, we should do the exact same thing. Sorry.
Very good.
I bored you.
Very good. And let me, I'll ask what I think might be the last question. So when a foreign policy is based on not letting bad things happen or preventing bad things from happening, what, if any, space is there for morals or values in such a foreign policy?
Okay, I want to start by answering this question by saying I have a golden retriever that I really love, and I like people and things like that. I think that we should stop lying about morals. I wouldn't want a president of the United States to not talk about freedom and democracy and so on and so forth. But one of the things that gets us tripped up is that we say we have red lines and they're based on morals. And then there's no evidence ever that we've ever kept. They're not red and they're not lines. And so I actually just wrote an article about this in which I said we should stop this. It hurts us. It hurts us by saying, again, I don't want the president to not talk about democracy and morals and so on and so forth, but let that just be rhetoric, not that the Saudis are pariahs, and then 3 months later, fist bumping with the Saudis. That just makes us look really stupid. We should just defend what our strategic interests are and not be apologetic about it.
Very good. So on that note, thank you very much. I think we have to wrap it. That was fascinating.
No pleasure. Appreciate their books here. I'm happy to sign if you like. If you get one, I'm happy to sign it for you. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.